Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to today's session of the NPTEL course entitled Introduction to World Literature. Today we are looking at one of the important essays on translation by Gayatri, Chakravorty, Spivak. It's titled The Politics of Translation. The significance of looking at this essay as part of a course on world literature also lies in the multiple layers of politics and the translations which are part of the process of framing something we now term as world literature. As you've begun to notice, most of the text that we deal with, they are the text which has been translated and which are getting circulated in different parts of the world outside the original place where it was published, the original location where it began to get circulated, the original culture which received it. This translation and this circulation could be within the same time frame, it could be across decades, it could be across centuries, and in certain cases it could date back to even the earlier periods such as the 1st century AD. So given that, when Spivak is talking about the politics of translation, it also places into context the many things that we need to engage with and the many things that one needs to factor in while one is talking about the act of translation, especially within a post-colonial context. In this sense, I also want to draw your attention to some of the observations in the contemporary where post-colonial literature is seen as always already world literature, because there's a way in which post-colonial writings, they begin to get translated and they begin to get visibility. Once they are translated into English, once they gain more visibility across their countries and places of origin. And post-colonialism also has been seen as one of the ways in which the literary world begins to have dialogues with each other, how there is more and better communication across cultures, and more importantly, post-colonialism and literature produced from the post-colonial worlds, it has been seen as a very powerful non-Eurocentric production of literature, of culture. It has been seen as the kind of output which is coming out from developing countries, which is coming out from non-Western perspectives, coming out from non-white perspectives. And that is something that contemporary world literature, the canonization of contemporary world literature, the framing of contemporary world literature, that's something that the theorists are also looking forward to. While talking about Spivak, she's a post-colonial theorist and she's also best known for her work which translated of grammatology by Derrida from French into English. And in this work, The Politics of Translation, she's looking at the personal experience of having translated two important works. One, Derrida's Of Grammatology from French to English, and the other one, Mahashweta Devi's works from an Indian language, Bengali, into English. So she's looking at both of these processes and trying to look at the politics inherent in it and trying to analyze the frameworks within which she operates, and the position that she adopts is that of a post-colonial feminist critic. The Politics of Translation is an essay which was written in 1993 that she considers translation as an important approach in pursuing the feminist agenda as well. So when she's talking about translation, it is not entirely about the technical aspects of translation. She's also addressing the subject position that she's inhabiting. She's also taking into account the various political positions, the various ideological belief systems within which her work is also situated in. So apart from being a post-colonial theorist, there are certain very pertinent belief systems within which, rather the ideological systems within which Spivak tries to position her work, which is feminist as well as Marxist. And there is also a very prominent post-structuralist approach which one can begin to see, and having mentioned the association that she had with Derrida's work, it's also very, very deconstructive in nature. And in this work, The Politics of Translation, she is largely pursuing this large agenda, the grand agenda of achieving women's solidarity. And she is trying to bring into question issues related to gender, issues related to feminist politics, and she's trying to position it in the larger context of translation, which is also an important factor when one begins to talk about world literature. So there are three approaches which we find coming together in this particular essay. First one, feminist, then post-colonialist and post-structuralist. And there is of course language and the ways in which texts move across languages, which is also could be seen as the heart of this entire work. So this is how she positions herself in this particular work, as a feminist translator. And this is very important for us to keep in mind, that translation here is not seen as an apolitical event. Translation is not seen as an event which could be pretty much the same regardless of who engages with it. It's not really about language. And she is bringing into discussion various things which are not directly associated with language, but things which would frame the ways in which ideas and particularly language gets articulated, particularly within literary and cultural contexts. And she's also pursuing and pushing this argument that ultimately it is about the politics that defines the act of translation. Translation, when it is undertaken by people with various subject positions, with different ideologies, it is going to have a different outcome altogether. There is no single linear way in which one text can be translated into the other. There are the underlying politics of race, ethnicity, caste, gender, all of this comes into play when one text is translated from a certain language to the other. And this, Spivak argues, is all the more pertinent in the post-colonial context. And that's a kind of comparison and the foil that she tries to bring in when she is positioning Derrida's of grammatology on the one end and Mahashweta Devi's works on the other. And something that she continued to emphasize throughout this work, right from the beginning, is the aspect of identity. And here I read out to you an excerpt from one of Spivak's own work, which she also quotes in this particular essay, where she's talking about the certain kind of risks that she takes while she engages in translation. And this she refers particularly with respect to the translation that she undertook from 18th century Bengali poetry to English. And this is a quote that she quotes from her own work from Translator's Preface. "I must overcome what I was taught in school, the highest mark for the most accurate collection of synonyms, strung together in the most proximate syntax. I must resist both the solemnity of chaste Victorian poetic prose and the forced simplicity of plain English that have imposed themselves as the norm. Translation is the most intimate act of reading. I surrender to the text when I translate. These songs, sung day after day in family chorus before clear memory began, have a peculiar intimacy for me. Reading and surrendering take on new meanings in such a case. The translator earns permission to transgress from the trace of the other before memory in the closest places of the self." So here translation is seen as a vital act, a political act, where one engages with self, with questions of identity, and it is also an act of reading. And this is how she positions translation. It is not the technical superimposition from one language to the other. On the other hand, it itself is an act of reading. The translated text thus becomes a different text altogether. It becomes a text which is read in a different way and which is again presented to another set of audience in an entirely different way. So when language changes, this essay and the many discussions around it, it also draws attention to this fact that when language changes, there are multiple things which undergo change along with it. It becomes a different text and it's being received by a different set of audience who have a different cultural ethos, who have a different literary tradition. So it's not the same text which gets translated, it is a different text which gets received and circulated. And this probably is one thing that we need to keep in mind even when we are engaging with the texts which are in circulation, the texts which have been translated. And even when the text is not translated, for instance, if we are looking at Shakespeare, if we are looking at one of the English iconic texts which come to us in form of circulation across traveling across centuries, traveling across spaces, one needs to keep in mind that the text undergoes a radical change the moment the sense of audience changes. The text undergoes a radical change the moment the location and the structures within which the text gets received undergoes change. And that's something that Spivak also tries to pursue further within a post-colonialist, feminist and post-structuralist framework. And very soon into the essay, she draws her attention to the act of translation as it happens within the post-colonial situation, the third world texts, and what happens when those texts are translated into English. In her own words, it is more just to give access to the largest number of feminists. Therefore, these texts must be made to speak in English. It is more just to speak the language of the majority when through hospitality a large number of feminists give the foreign feminists the right to speak in English. In the case of the third world foreigner, is the law of the majority that of decorum, the equitable law of democracy, or the law of the strongest? And further down she says, in the act of wholesale translation into English, there can be a betrayal of the democratic ideal into the law of the strongest. This happens when all the literature of the third world gets translated into a sort of with its translatees, so that the literature by a woman in Palestine begins to resemble in the feel of its prose something by a man in Taiwan. The rhetoricity of Chinese and Arabic, the cultural politics of high growth capitalist Asia Pacific and devastated West Asia, gender difference inscribed and inscribing in these differences. And she goes on to give a very real pertinent example of translating Mahashweta Devi's short stories, Dhanadayini. There are two different titles and translations which are available. She says the one version which is titled Breast Giver, the alternative title which gives the title The Wet Nurse. And in the second, the first one, of course, she also points out that Breast Giver is the title approved by the original author herself. And in the second one, what happens is when Dhanadayini is translated into The Wet Nurse, it neutralizes the author's irony in constructing an uncanny word, enough like wet nurse to make that sense and enough unlike to shock. And what are the implications here when the same text is translated as the wet nurse and the breast giver? What difference does it bring in? Towards the end of that section, she says, if the two translations are read side by side, the laws of the rhetorical silences of the original can be felt from one to the other. So what are the things that she is trying to tell us from this point of time onwards about translation, about identity, and about certain things which are retained, and more importantly about certain things which are entirely lost in this certain forms of translation? It's then that she begins to argue, she begins to position her arguments in place. First, then the translator must surrender to the text. She must solicit the text to show the limits of its language, because that rhetorical aspect will point at the silence of the absolute frame of language that the text wards off in its special manner. From this, she moves on to the feminist approach. From then, she moves on to talk about what role gender plays, how her own position as a feminist translator can be employed to engage in a dialogue with these otherwise predominantly post-colonialist as well as post-structuralist frameworks, and how language itself becomes entirely different in the hands of a feminist scholar, how language becomes a tool to engage with identity, to engage with the self of the original writer, the self of the author, when it is being used by a feminist post-colonial scholar like Spivak. She also uses a very predominantly sexual analogy to talk about the act of translation. Arguing for the need to surrender, she says, to surrender in translation is more erotic than ethical. So there is an emotional element which is brought into it. There is a very abstract thing which happens at the level of gender, at the level of surrender, surrendering the self of the translator and allowing the self of the translator to surrender to the text. That is something that Spivak seems to highlight throughout this work. So as a translator, as a feminist post-colonial translator, Spivak is fully aware of the challenges that she is facing while translating, and she also therefore understands why one tends to play safe there are certain ways in which one would side with logic over rhetorical inferences. But she also says that in doing so, one also runs the risk of losing certain vital clues which are hidden in the text, and there would be certain metaphors which would get lost, and she warns the translator, predominantly the feminist translator, against these things, and says that it's important to develop love and affinity for the text which is being translated. Unless there is a relation, predominantly that of surrender, that is established with the text, the translation may lose certain vital aspects during the process. And this is something that she begins to foreground from the beginning of the discussion, that there should be a relation between the translated and the text. And this relation, as she puts it, it's more of an erotic nature, it's of surrender than being more ethical or technical. And she also says that this is something that would hold the agency of the translator and would also keep her audience at bay. One of the key things in this essay is her concern with the politics of translation from a non-European woman's text. And she also quotes Derrida in this context to say, "I must speak in a language that is not my own, because that will be more just." And she says, "I want to claim the right to the same dignified complaint for a woman's text in Arabic or Vietnamese." And here, what she's trying to do, and in its essence, is to challenge the English language dominated feminist movements which are there across the globe. And she's also trying to push this argument further and comment that there's a way in which the law of majority silences the minority language feminists within the Western world, but it is also a certain West-centric, a certain Eurocentric kind of feminism is also being sold to the other developing third world countries. And in her own words, in the act of wholesale translation into English, as we have already seen, there can be a betrayal of the democratic ideal into the law of the strongest. So I want to now take you to the main discussion that I would also like to foreground in today's lecture, which is her engagement with non-Western, non-European texts. She gives as one of the examples, the example from Toni Morrison's Beloved, and this is the excerpt that I read to you. "The scene of violence between mother and daughter, reported and passed on by the daughter Sete to her daughter Denver, who carries the name of a white trash girl in partial acknowledgement of women's solidarity in birthing, is then the condition of impossibility of Beloved." So this is the excerpt from the novel. "She picked me up and carried me behind the smoke house. Back there, she opened up her dress front and lifted her breast and pointed under it. Right on her rib was a circle and a cross burnt right in the skin. She said, 'This is your ma'am, this.' And she pointed. 'Yes, ma'am,' she said. 'But how will you know me?' 'Mark me too,' I said. 'Did she?' asked Denver. She slapped my face. 'What for?' I didn't understand it then, not till I had a mark of my own." And this scene, Spivak argues, of claiming the brand of the owner as my own to create in this broken chain of marks owned by separate white male agents of property an unbroken chain of rememory in enslaved daughters as agents of history not to be passed on, is of necessity different from Friday's scene of withheld writing from the white woman wanting to create history by giving her own language. And the lesson is the impossibility of translation in the general sense. I want to draw your attention to this point that she is making, the impossibility of translation. There are certain contexts, deep-rooted cultural contexts, and certain feminist ethos, which she is particularly referring to over here, which cannot be translated only if one relies entirely on the technical knowledge of language. It demands something more deep, intimate, and personal. Some of the terms that she uses is surrender, an erotic relation, a love relation between the translator and the text. And she argues that, Spivak continues to argue that the translated text begins to resemble the original, or the translated text begins to gain an identity of its own only when this relation exists in terms of identity, in terms of selfhood between the translator and the translated work. And this being an essay that we shall come back to at a later point towards the end of the course again, I want you to pay attention to some of the important aspects that she is drawing your attention to. So, we shall not be going into the many details of this essay right now. We shall definitely be coming back to take a look at it towards the end of this course. And when she is talking about reading as translation, and when she is talking about this particularly towards the end of the essay in terms of its conclusion, I again read the excerpt to you. I want to show how the post-colonial as the outside insider translates white theory as she reads, so that she can discriminate on the terrain of the original. She wants to use what is useful. And again, I hope this can pass on a lesson to the translator in the narrow sense. I like the way this essay gets structured. There are certain examples that she uses, and she also tries to theorize on the basis of that. And as pointed out at the outset, this theorization happens through three major frameworks. One is post-colonialist, post-structuralist, and feminist. One of the things that Spivak tries to do in this essay is to show how translation has been manipulated to disseminate an ideologically motivated image of post-colonial countries. And this can be more succinctly observed when we look at some of the other essays by Spivak, like Can the Subaltern Speak, and her other observations on comparative literature and how that also gets positioned within the framework of world literature. And having noticed that Spivak has dismantled the preconceived notion of feminism and the thoughts about post-colonial literature and society, which can get visibility, which can get circulation only through English, we also see how critical she is being about this act of translation, which eventually talks about translation in a very one-sided way, in a very lopsided way, about everything getting translated into English language and getting circulated across the globe wherever English is spoken, wherever English gets dominated. And we also know that more and more it's becoming centrally the language of academia. Just as much it is also the language of politics and the language of our global economy. And one thing perhaps she hopes to be able to generate is this discussion, which will also increase historical, socio-cultural, ideological and political understanding about the society, about which predominantly the European Western feminists have been showing solidarity, mostly from the outer peripheries through hegemonic English psyche. So, this is evidently an attack on the Western feminist model, where an articulation in favor of the post-colonial societies, an articulation in favor of the gender situation in post-colonial countries is made possible only when that articulation happens in this language English. So, the hegemony that English language always already had, and the kind of politics that it comes into contact with, which tries to rescue the women from the post-colonial countries, and Spivak begins to see a mismatch over here. It's for the same reason that Spivak mentions this about herself. My position is generally a reactive one. I am viewed by Marxists as too codic, by feminists as too male-identified, by indigenous theorists as too committed to Western theory. I am uneasily pleased about this. So, there is something about Spivak's position which questions the very frameworks through which she engages with a lot of texts that she talks about, like feminist, post-structuralist and post-colonialist. So, in that sense, I also find it useful to engage with Spivak, because she also critiques the very terms on which world literature, translation, comparative literature and post-colonial literature are being based on. And this is not to say that there is an easy equation between post-colonial literature and world literature, but this tool, this framework that Spivak is using would be very, very handy in analyzing some of the texts, when we also get to know that the text that we access, the text that we analyze, the text that lends itself to any kind of academic interpretation is also the text which has been refashioned and reoriented into English language. So, this might be quite removed from the reality that it represented. It might be quite removed from the original circulation and the reception that the text had in the first place. But nevertheless, what's important to note is that we are also dealing with something inevitable over here, this politics of translation, which privileges Western academies, which privileges the hegemony of English language. That's also something that one should begin to deal with. So, the advantage of work such as Spivak's Politics of Translation is not to undermine the efforts being made to translate from different languages across the world into English, but the danger lies in seeing this as the only kind of articulation possible. So one of the possible ways in which one can begin to respond to these things is also by taking into account the native scholarship, also by taking into account the frameworks which are non-Western, frameworks which are predominantly nativistic. And this is something that Spivak also does not really provide as an alternative framework, and that's also something that we need to be critically aware of, that while in Spivak's work, we can clearly see what is being undermined, we can clearly see what is being critiqued, the alternative frameworks that she tentatively proposes, they do not emerge sufficiently well. So for the same reason, it's also important to look inward when one is dealing with world literature, to know what the local scholarship, the local interpretative frameworks deal with, how significantly possible it is to engage with the text without necessarily engaging with it through the lens of Western or predominantly European literary frameworks and literary traditions. With this, I wrap up today's session, and I would also encourage you to take a look at this essay in detail, so that when we come back to look at it at a later point of time towards the end of the course, there would be larger issues that we can engage with in a more critical way, in a more detailed way, by also bringing into discussion the text that we have covered as part of this course. With this, I wrap up today's lecture. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.